Hello and welcome to DevSecCon 24. This is me, Peter Maddison. I'm here to give you the talk on securing your pipes with a TACO, which is really about the people and process of automating governance. I always have these talks structured around these talk maps. So this idea of we're going to start with an introduction, we're going to run through a little bit about what risk is, some things about automating governance and how you can go about doing that, and why and how to make a TACO. And then we're going to wrap up with some Q&A and some final points. So who am I? I'm Peter Maddison. I'm a coach, a consultant, and founder of a consultancy called Zodiac out of Toronto, Canada. I do all sorts of things in my career, from being a program manager to rolling out global identity systems to helping organizations adopt value stream management. And these days I work a lot on risk as it's associated to value streams. So I'm going to start us off here for a way of introduction to talk about the fast-paced world we live in. And we're in a world where we have to be able to deliver value to our customers quickly. Customers demand instant gratification. We all carry around these little black rectangles that have these applications on them. And if the application isn't doing what we want, we'll download another one that does. And we've gone from this world in the past where it was all about we buy technology based on how much it costs, what's the cheapest I can get that thing for, to a world where we were buying technology based on the introduction of how everything integrated, all of the different capabilities we could build off of the networked capabilities of different technology we could glue together. And we're now moving into this world where it's really the customer that's driving the experience, the customer that dictates the value. And a lot of the complexity is being put behind the scenes. And our companies now need to be able to move towards this idea of value delivery. How do we deliver value faster to our customers? And there's lots of tools out there that will help you accelerate your value delivery, all sorts of things that'll do this. But it's really, these efforts tend to fail more from a lack of clarity, not the tools. There's lots of things in organizations and the way that we work together that get in the way of us being able to actually deliver this value to our clients. So a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about through this presentation comes from some work I did a few years ago with a couple of large banks where we were looking at helping them accelerate their DevOps strategy, helping them move from a very traditional SDLC setup to one where we had much more continuous delivery-ish type processes in place, and that we were starting to look at different ways of operating, different ways of learning. And a large part of this ended up being all around security, compliance, and how do we start to get those aligned into the way that we both build our pipelines and that we deliver value. So a lot of the things that we had to do all involved change, and change is a very tough thing. We have to be able to change, but we're very bad at it. We really shy away from it. And one of the big things that we need to be able to do in order to go through or to accept any change is to be able to say, okay, we're good. We accept the risks and we're okay to make this change for us. And along comes DevOps, where we can say, okay, so people, process, and tools working together deliver rapid and continuous delivery of value to customers. This is wonderful. And as we were saying, it's like there's still all of this focus on the tools, a little bit on the processes, and we moved some processes into the tools without really looking at the process and how they change. But we haven't really spent as much time as we should on what does this do to the people as we're changing. And this is all very easy, right? It's so easy to bring all of these new ways of working, introduce all these new factors, these new tools, all of this new change as we move forward to start to get better at value delivery. It's a lot to cope with. And human beings aren't necessarily all that good at dealing with change. We go through these stages as we look at change, and new paradigms and new ways of working, and all of the new things that we have to learn send us through this. And we often start with this idea that, well, we don't want to do this. It's like, it's not going to happen to us. We're going to ignore it completely, to complaining, no, you can't do that. That'll never work here, to starting to plead with people that, please don't do this to me, to actually sulking and complaining about, well, okay, I guess we have to do it now, to finally accepting the change. And a lot of what we're talking about when we start to adopt DevOps type practices and agile type practices is, how do we lower this adoption change? this adoption curve? How do we make it easier for us to adopt change? How do we make it easier for the organization to take change on and do this faster? So going back to the engagements that I was doing, we'd started down this. They were doing some of the right things, and I started to help them build out some platforms and look at, okay, how do we start to create platforms that make it easier so that it's not so difficult to change, so it's easier to onboard people, build out blueprinted pipelines that we can provide to our development teams. Will then be able to integrate all of these products and solve a lot of where their pain points are so they can get faster at being able to deliver value. And so we drew a lot of pictures. We set up a number of communities. We started to educate and train and upskill and introduce new concepts out into the teams. And this went relatively well and had some good impact. But then we started to hit a wall. And the wall that we were hitting, working within a large regulated organization, was the one around audit and compliance. And there was these problems where, okay, so we're accelerating it. We've built these pipelines. Yes, it allows us to overcome certain what were very manual control gates previously, but we needed some other ways of being able to demonstrate that we were doing the right things, because we hadn't necessarily brought the security, compliance, and audit, or even maybe architecture into the understanding of, hey, look, what we're doing isn't really breaking any of the rules that you have. How do we demonstrate to you that we're doing the right thing and that we're going to do the right thing at speed? And what is it you need to be able to do that in order for you to see that? So that was the introduction. So that's kind of setting the stage for the kind of problem set that we were seeing all around DevOps, and how we started to run into these problems dealing with what we might want to call the safety part of the organization, the compliance, audit, security, all of those parts of the organization. Now let's talk a little bit about risk. So now, if we look at governance, risk, and compliance, this is a way of looking at how we manage risk within the organization. And this really is about what are the different things that we can do to both understand risk and put into place to ensure that we are properly identifying those risks and managing them appropriately for the circumstances that we're doing things. Unfortunately, in a lot of times in organizations, where these practices are sometimes done with a group that's sort of somewhat aligned to what technology is doing, but they're often off to one side, and they're much smaller, and they don't necessarily have the capacity to be able to be involved in every decision that's being made. So we needed some ways to bring them closer to what we were building out in terms of a platform to provide them assurance that we were appropriately managing risk in the acceleration of delivery that we were doing, and that they had a firm understanding that everything that we were helping enable the delivery teams to do to deliver value was going in the right direction and meeting the organizational requirements. So what we were seeing really was that there was also some things were getting lost in translation, because from a DevOps perspective, we were saying, well, we're definitely ensuring that our environments are secure. We're putting all the right pieces into place. And the fact that everything's automated, we're delivering it in very small chunks, we're starting to accelerate these pieces. This is in itself ensuring that we're providing more secure delivery because we've got greater insight into how we're doing things. But what we were seeing was that there was things that were getting lost in translation between the different areas of the organization. So developers, for example, were trying to make sure they're building right things, but their language that they're using was not that the testing teams were using, and testing really was starting to move and become more integrated with the development teams anyway. The operations teams were breaking down that divide between development and operations, but there was still very much different language barriers between them as there was between security. And this is one of the other barriers we're seeing. And with cloud compliance and with architecture, all talking their own languages. And it goes beyond that, even into sales and marketing. Every part of the organization has their own taxonomy, their own language, their own way of referring to things, their own models for looking at the world. And a lot of what we were seeing we were needing to do as we started to automate across these different areas was there was a need to be able to help each of these different areas understand what the concerns were of the other areas, and at least provide visibility into what those models they were using were. And we need some form of creating a common language so that these different areas were comfortable that as we started to automate things, we were doing the right things that were going to help them move forward. So what I did at this point, going back to the conversation around the bank, was I went and I sat down in particular with the compliance group that was closely aligned to the technology area. And I invited them out for coffee, and we sat down and we had a chat about, well, what is it you need? What is it you need to see in our pipelines that will ensure that we are delivering securely, we're properly managing risk, we're properly identifying the things that should be identified, and that if there are controls or regulations that we need to be aware of, that those aren't getting lost as we start to accelerate our delivery in our pipelines. So that brings us to automating governance. So that was a bit around risk and the kinds of things that we were looking at. Now let's talk a little bit about automating the governance of these pipelines. So the first part of this is understanding, is there a risk? Is there something that we need to be concerned about here? So one part of this, and there's some very interesting ways of doing this in microservice architectures now, where if we take a look at this from a domain-driven design perspective, we can look at boundaries and start to auto-classify groupings of microservices and then start to assign risk based on our understanding from a business side what those might look like through different types of metadata. And there's some very interesting ways of solving that. But that takes us from a very technical viewpoint of what is it in my environment, then what is it doing, and how do I understand its risk? But there's many, many other types of risks that I need to be aware of across the organization. From a technology perspective, it can be difficult to keep track of all of these. So I need some way of getting closer to what's happening in the pipeline to determine, is this something I need to be concerned about? So working with the security teams, we laid out some categorization of what would we consider to be a high risk change and what we consider a low risk change and what would be a medium change, largely categorized on usage of PII data within each of those different areas. And for our new standards that were being written, we started to incorporate those into the standards to start to make it more of the vernacular that was being used to communicate out to the delivery teams. This in turn started to drive more collaboration around, well, what is it we can do to start to automate some of these compliance checks into our different pipelines? Where can we go about automating these? What tools can we bring to the table to start to make these visible once we understand what it is that we need to be able to expose? So if we start with a pipeline, and this one's taken from a great IT Revolution white paper that John Willis contributed to, and there's a reference to this later in this slide deck. If we think about how the pipeline works, there's many critical points at which we can start to implement automated governance and implement controls. Starting from the source code repository, the code that's being checked in, the builds, dependency management, packages and artifact management, non-production deploys and into the production deploys. One of the problems that we see is very often in organizations, the security team is only there right at the very, very end. The security team is the stop right before production to say, hey, no, you can't do that. By which point, of course, it's far too late. Really what we want to be able to do is say, okay, have we checked for all of the security compliance at every single one of these stages? So we think, well, okay, we need a way to be able to do that. And when we get to running the pipes that we start to build, we start with this idea that if this is our view of what the different stages along the pipeline are, when we run the pipe, we can start to think about what is the flow of work that we see. So if the different things that we can capture from a governance perspective and we can use as references to be able to say, okay, if we want to ensure that we're doing the right thing and that we're not introducing risk, what areas can we pull information from and how can we ensure that we're doing the right thing? So we start with how is the work defined? Once we understand how that work is defined, we can create it as source code. We can turn all of our creation into source code. We can then use our CI tools to build that out. And this refers to one of those early diagrams with our automated pipelines. We then take both quality tests and build results, which can then be validated and checked for before we build artifacts. And the artifacts then are the pieces that then get deployed into all subsequent environments. We never want to be rebuilding artifacts at later stages. By splitting our CI runs out into two, this also allowed us to ensure that certain organizational tests were always taken care of, that we made sure that we were not missing any tests that the security or compliance teams were needed to see happen. And as we started to build these out, what we realized was that the manual checks, we found other ways of solving those, moving code reviews away from being in pull requests and moving them into the delivery teams directly through looking at techniques like mob and pair programming, ensuring that we're properly documenting outcomes, making sure that there was a good, strong understanding within the delivery teams as to making sure that we had proof that the code had been properly managed and reviewed. Code signing was used in some areas around critical projects as well. Once we had different ways of managing certificates, that caused a number of different problems. And then we also realized that we could start to remove later manual steps as well. As we started to look at that end-to-end pipeline, we managed to remove some of the manual steps that were occurring, especially around database deploys, where that was still something of a sticking point within the organization. All of the while we were measuring the end-to-end cycle time and ensuring that we were using that as a metric to help us improve. From auditing the pipeline, we've now had a massive data. From looking at all these different places, we could pull information out. Our first iteration of this used some tools that come out of the Capital One space. We ran into some problems with that as even though it's an open source platform, as the various plugins to things like Urban Code Deploy, which we were using as Urban Code Deploy upgraded, and the plugins didn't upgrade fast enough, and we didn't have the development bandwidth to update the open source code. So we switched from that initial model to one that used logging and Elastic and Elk to basically do visualization of the logs, and that in turn allowed us to start to pull out some very interesting metrics that we were using both to radiate back to the organization our progress and give development teams insight as well as to what was happening within these automated pipelines we were building. Of course, these paved roads are great. I mean, one of the advantages we had as we started to go on this journey and build out these models was we could blueprint them, and we provided them back to the organization as ways of being able to deliver code faster, and we could measure how many of these were starting to be used, which was great. But we also realized that this model wasn't for everybody, that the more advanced users wanted direct access into the APIs we were using behind the scenes so that they could go faster than we could possibly make changes. So the way we started to manage this was that here's the easy button for the 80% of the organization that really wants a path to go forward and start to get better at this and start to learn and get this as a way to start to do that. We then integrated the various control points into that so that we provide a bit of a carrot to come and use it. And then we looked for the other bits of the organization, the more advanced users, we started to provide more direct access so they could start to build out solutions and we could learn from them and incorporate them back into the platform. And taking one of the other advantages of taking that approach was that it allowed us to learn from the users of the pipelines that we were building. It allowed us to also consider that, well, maybe we want to do this a different way. Maybe we want to go in a different direction. We don't want to just say, hey, here's a set of ways of doing things. Here's the pipeline that all of you must use. You must do it this way in order for us to remain secure. That wasn't going to build up the trust that we needed. We didn't have the bandwidth within the teams I was working with to be able to do that. So what we were doing was we were, what I like to say, we were using it like we would use Waze on your phone. Like we were allowing people to take an alternate path. Maybe there's a different place that you want to go. Maybe you want to stop by and see something else, which will give you an opportunity to learn along the way. And as long as you're taking care of the right governance controls and doing the right things, then we can make sure that we're providing you the support and the understanding that you need to be able to move forward. So that's all about automating governance. So one of the principal points here is that it's not about keeping audit off your back. It's about providing, it's not about having a checklist that we make sure has been checked. It's about collaboratively making sure we're baking capabilities into the pipelines that we're delivering. Make sure you start small. Don't try and boil the ocean and do everything all at once. Getting one team working. We started with one pipeline across the organization to do a common use case, and we then iterated from there. We also spent a lot of time on engaging leaders, focusing on conversation and not tooling, to make sure that we were accessing the right outcomes, that we were looking at the right things, that we were working towards delivering the value that was actually truly going to help the organization. So with all of that said, then it's about so we've talked about the introduction around DevOps, and we've talked about the types of risk and how risk comes about. Talked about how we could go about automating governance and things that we were doing in particular to automate governance into pipelines. Let's talk about, well, TACO and how that helped with all of this. So I realized, having started to build out some more of these blueprints for pipelines, there were some commonalities in what it was that we needed to deliver from a compliance point of view. Some water. So from a modeling perspective, we started to see that, okay, so as we look at what we need to show from compliance, the first part of this would be traceability. We want to identify what happens in the pipe. For that, we wanted to understand chain of custody, what the test results, deployed version is tracked, how the change is recorded. So making sure that we understood all the way along the pipeline what was necessary to show that, yes, we understood what happened, that nothing has changed, that we're delivering the thing that we said we were going to deliver. We also, we then went on to look at like access. How do we secure the delivery process? And for this, we were looking at like who has access to the source code. Is creator checked? If we're building it once and deploying many, so we're not redoing the source code, there's an opportunity to make changes, that we're properly using hashes to demonstrate that what we're doing, and that any deployments only come from the pipelines. So we were starting to build out a set of models. Like, if you want to be able to push things into production, you need to be able to do all of these things. Validating the payload in the pipeline. So if we wanted to make sure there was a proper peer review, that we had to be able to show that segregation of duties, that we were properly managing that, and that there was evidence of that being collected, which we were doing through a variety of methods in terms of collecting the logs, showing that more than one person had been working on it, and demonstrating that back from an auditing perspective. We were scanning the code, scanning the artifact, bringing integrations into the pipeline, and making sure that when we started to raise defects or problems from that these were then being fed back into the delivery teams, fixing, and then tracking how many of those were being fixed. Recording, execution, monitoring, validating the target, making sure that we're not just deploying blindly, that we understand that the target system is in the state that we expect it to be in, validating the quality of what we're delivering, and make sure the tests have been run, that proper things have happened, checking it works, and then validating that the execution is actually behaving as it was. We also set up a set of auditing ones to validate that even these controls were then properly being implemented on each of the pipelines. And then my daughter drew a lovely picture to help explain this as well, which is the TACO. So traceability, access, compliance, and operations. And the point here was to give it a name like this was that it made a very useful mnemonic. It made it very easy for all of the different teams, remember my Rosetta Stone, to be able to understand what it was we were talking about when we were delivering platform capabilities out to the delivery teams, when we were delivering these pipelines. They could understand that this is what I need to make sure I've taken care of. These are the things I need to know, rather than have to wade through hundreds of lines of documents and hundreds and hundreds of controls. As long as I've taken care of these in my DevOps pipelines, I know that my pipeline itself is secure. In order to help communicate with compliance teams, we also set this up in a very similar way that they were used to. Our initial version of this was as a spreadsheet, which we then codified into a database. And this was in this format, in terms of what is the purpose of this? What is the control we're using for it? What is the artifact that will be used to track it? Where's that stored? What happens in terms of the happy and the sad path if the control is passed or the control has failed, and who's going to own this? And we documented each of the controls in this manner for each of the purposes, and then provided this as a spreadsheet out to the teams. This also allowed us to very simply visualize it, which is, and visualizations are a great way as well to help lock things into people's minds, to help them visualize, yeah, hey, how much more of this do I have to do to get better? We also set up some workshops. I did this with some subsequent work I did around, if we take that TACO model and we look at how can we help understand and break this down and to systematically look at where do controls exist? What sort of controls can we introduce into our pipeline? Where can we manage these? What might that look like? And then working through this so we can say, okay, so for us to deliver, what controls do we need and how are we going to manage those and where are we going to get the information from and radiate it back? And this allowed us to break this down in terms of what is the input and the output across each of these stages, and how do we have the discussion? So this, as with a lot of these mapping exercises, the value here was that by bringing security and compliance and the delivery team to the table to have this conversation, we had a much more open conversation, very quickly could come to an understanding of, hey, what do we need to do to move forward here? And what things should we have in its place of controls? How have we properly mitigated the risks within the systems we're deploying? If you took a really complicated look at it, we started to build out pipelines that looked like this, which has got many, many different control points, which is far too complex to go through in a presentation deck like this. So if you think about this in terms of, we're going to build, validate, test, and deploy, and we want to understand where those controls are and what happens if the controls fail. And by mapping it out this way, we could very simply say, okay, if I understand what's happening at each phase of delivery, and these are not gates, these are just phases as we start to deliver, I can now understand also what happens, where does it go, who's going to respond to it, how do I know what to do in the event of a failure. An example very similar to this is Capital One also has a list of, these are the different things that need to happen along a given pipeline. And I've got a link to an article that talks about each of these and how they're using it. They didn't give it a name like TACO, but they did something very similar as well. Another real world example is from Nationwide Building Society and the BVSSH community that I help run in North America. They had Nationwide come and talk quite recently, and the talks that they gave were great. There was a series of Ignite talks and I think they also gave them in Europe, and it's a great video to watch to see how their organization has started to automate governance into pipelines, and how they've automated the delivery to make sure that it's easier for delivery teams to get the information they need in the context they need it to be able to make decisions faster. And also how they then displayed that information to make what they call these intelligent control boards, which give them a lot of insight into how things are occurring in terms of management of risk through the different pipelines. So to kind of wrap this up, there's this idea that it's not really about DevOps or even really DevSecOps. It's really about say risk, dev risk, ops risk. Like risk is part of all throughout the entire system. We need to make sure that we're considering this from the beginning, that we're considering it as we start to deploy things, and we're considering it all the way at the end to make sure that our entire end-to-end system, we're understanding and considering what the risks are and putting the appropriate control piece in place. So now let's wrap up and go through the quick Q&A. So we can't solve the same problems with the same thinking we used to create them. Here are some great references that I'd highly recommend reading. And a lot of the content in this talk comes from these places. And so let's review. What we've gone through is there's a common way of understanding what a good pipeline is, a good, well-governed pipeline. So this is how we can go about creating it. Using a mnemonic like TACO, or come up with your own mnemonic, or expand upon that, is a great way of giving a common understanding in the organization across all of these different areas that are all talking different languages as to what is it we need to do to make sure that we're doing the right thing. Safety is about behavior, not just tools. It's this, by having these conversations and talking about these pieces, they don't get swept under the rug, and we don't make assumptions because it's too difficult, or we're rushing, or we're trying to put something through. And we also don't end up slowing things down when we don't need to. There's lots of different ways to help automate software delivery compliance, and hopefully some of the pieces in here has given you some ideas from like the people and process ways, how to start conversations and talk about different ways of managing compliance in the pipelines. And it's all about creating that common language around this, and that's what TACO is for. And so thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference. There's a quick survey here if anybody wants to do it. I'm always happy to get feedback, and happy to chat some more about this stuff. Thank you very much.